I think of home, I think of a place where there's love overflowing. I wish I was home, I wish I was back there with the things I've been knowing. Wind that makes the tall grass bend into leaning. Suddenly the raindrops that fall have a meaning. Sprinkling the sea makes it all clean. Maybe there's a chance for me to go back now that I have some direction. It sure would be nice to be back home where there's love and affection. And just maybe I can convince time to slow up, giving me enough time in my life to grow up. Time be my friend and let me start again. Suddenly my world's gonna change its face now that I know where I'm going. I have had my mind spin around in space, yet I watch it growing. And if you're listening, God, please don't make it hard for me to know that we should believe the things that we see. Tell me, should we run away or should we try to stay? Or would it be better just to let things be? Living here in this brand new world might be a fantasy, but it's taught me to love. So it's real to me. And I learn that we must look inside our hearts to find a world full of love, like yours, like mine, like home.
The reading that I am sharing with you today are words from Wendell Berry, The Peace of Wild Things. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into this peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. The Wednesday after the election, this was the first brief text exchange I had with a friend. Devastating. I don't know what I'm going to do today. I don't know how I'm going to do today. Me neither. But here we are. Here we are. We talked about the things that we would do to cope, maybe a guided meditation. I think that they said they did 3 already that morning. and definitely taking one thing at a time. And then on a whim, I told her I came across this Wendell Berry poem last week, and I find myself reading it over and over again and again, and so I sent it. When despair for the world grows in me, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I come into the peace of wild things. I come into the presence of still water. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. This poem feeds my heart today, she responded. Admittedly, I was grateful to share it because it meant I got to read it again, and God knows I needed it. But, as they do, this conversation quickly fell into the past as the day went on, and then the next day, and then Friday morning comes, and I'm greeted by an email. A forward of a forward of a forwarded email sent to me by this friend with the subject line, forward, 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 grateful recipients of Wendell Berry's poem. The first line of the text in the email was from my friend. Hey there, I forwarded that poem to my husband. I found out he forwarded it to someone else, who then forwarded it across the country. I wanted to show you just how far that hope has spread. And as I continued to scroll down the email, I began to see names of people I do not know and probably will never meet. There was a Sheila who forwarded it to Kath, who sent it to Ken, who sent it to unnamed friends, but also immediately forwarded it to their Pilates teacher, who shared it with 2 Pilates classes that day. Mary sent it to her 85-year-old Sangha sister, who shared it with her community in Boulder, and apparently they got a lot of snow that week. And each time this was passed along, people shared how they received it. Tears were shed, and then I went out to look at a tree. I was reminded of healing in the midst of despair, and I was also reminded to take a walk. I will be sitting with this message of peace and calm. The very last email was signed, "With love and still hope." I was moved by this. It felt as if, unknown by all at the time, a little circle, beginning with just 2, and quickly spanning the country, one old-fashioned email forward at a time, this little circle grew wider and wider until it was holding all of us in these words. And we were all being held in our grief. And actually, it wasn't just the words of Wendell Berry that encircled us with that support. I think had all of these people found that poem on their own and read it, it certainly would have still offered comfort. But I felt like the real holding of the collective grief of that moment between people who didn't know each other came from sharing it. And not only sharing it, but then offering it back to the person who shared it. Because in that moment of emailing back and sharing their experience of the poem, they had the opportunity to connect their grief to a deep sense of gratitude for one another. And that was a gift that I was given too. As I read through this chain of forwarded emails, I was overwhelmed with gratitude. Gratitude for the awareness of the circle of which I was now a part. Gratitude for the chance to acknowledge it. Because too often, those circles of healing that we form and by which we are formed go unnoticed. We are surrounded by too much grief, acknowledged and otherwise, to be able to afford for healing and gratitude to go unnoticed. Even today, we find ourselves in the midst of 2 days of remembrance and grief. Our Trans Day of Remembrance and the National Day of Mourning. We are circled by these important and heavy days. So I wonder, how can we draw our circle wide enough to hold it all? In Unitarian Universalism, we use this language of drawing the circle wide. We even have a hymn about it in our hymnal. When we talk about our commitment to inclusivity and welcoming in our community, by drawing the circle wide, we claim responsibility to not only invite others into growth and healing that we strive for, we claim responsibility to commit ourselves to joining the circle. We, a community of diverse identities, which means we will each have a different role to play and different relationship to this commitment, to this healing, and to this grief. Yet, each of us are here. We are here. And it's up to us to ask ourselves and keep asking of each other, how do we widen our circle? This past Wednesday, November 20th, was the Trans Day of Remembrance, honoring the memory of those whose lives were lost in acts of anti-trans violence. Unfortunately, now more than ever, our trans community and our trans loved ones are facing fear and violence. So perhaps this sits even heavier this year. This Day of Remembrance was first established in 1998 when Rita Hester, a trans woman who actually lived right across the river in Alston, was murdered. And from the light of her life came a movement of love and connection that we continue to memorialize on the 20th every year. A time to remember that nobody holds this grief and fear alone, and to proclaim that we won't forget them and that we are still fighting for each other's lives. I find grief a remarkable thing. Last month, I preached about moments in our lives when we realize nothing will ever be the same again. Loss is one of those moments. And what I find miraculous about grief is that we find a way to revisit losses time and time again. And every time it looks a little different, as if we were passing a poem along to ourselves, but we changed some words around each time. And at some point, you begin showing the poem to others. And perhaps you realize that you're grateful to yourself for passing it along. And suddenly it goes from that small circle of two to encompass a whole community and even more grief There's actually a lot of power in that. As I sat with these stories and this grief this week, I noticed my own gratitude for this power, and I began to imagine it as a power that continued to emanate from a precious life, and a power that I'm grateful to sustain in this world. On the other side of this weekend, we honor another day of remembrance in the National Day of Mourning that Marcia spoke about earlier in the service. As we, a congregation on the unceded land of the Wampanoag, Massachusetts, and Nipmuc people, we, a community of people from so many other communities, as we honor this day of remembrance and mourning, it's worthwhile. In fact, I think it's necessary to honor that grief and notice the ways in which this grief also touches on that grief of the election, of other grief in your life. And I don't say that only because I think, that's a healthy way of dealing with grief, but because there is power in connecting to that collective grief. Since 1970, the Mashpee Wampanoag and other American Indian tribes and their allies have gathered at noon on the fourth Thursday of November to remember the genocide of millions, the theft of native land, and the erasure of native culture. It's a day of remembrance and spiritual connection, as well as a protest against the racism and prejudice that American Indians continue to experience. And if you remember last month, on the eve of Indigenous Peoples Day, First Parish's Indigenous Justice Working Group led a beautiful Sunday service that helped us examine what it means to live our faith's shared values of equity, generosity, justice, transformation, all centered around love, in the context of both the congregation's history and our land acknowledgement that beautifully illustrated how we have to approach this healing from that historical, personal, and communal perspective. They speak about the day of mourning in that service, and if you haven't seen it, I recommend looking at it. And yet again, today, and all week, we are faced with the depths of grief of our world, of violence, past, present, and the very real fear of violence in the future. And yet again, we turn to the power sustained in community, cultivated when we gather. I turn to the words of Alice Walker. She says, "At this time of mourning, may we be connected to each other. May we know the range and depth of feelings in ourselves and in each other, because there is vulnerability, fear, love, rage, hatred, compassion, courage, despair, and hope in ourselves, each other, and the world. May healing begin in us. May we form and become a circle." We are grieving. We are hopeful. We are empowered. We are a community made up of these communities, not apart. There are people who aren't here with us right now. and that's the grief. But we are here. We grieve lives cut short and communities who are building and rebuilding families, and we are here. As we allow ourselves to grieve, we connect to a deep source of love. And through that love, that great source of power, we remember, we mourn, we grieve because we are still fighting. And we are witnessing our community, our neighbor communities, and communities around the nation and world continue to fight. So I ask you again, how do we, in grief, draw our circle wider? How will you turn towards gratitude this week? For when the despair for the world grows in me, we can rest in the grace of the world. We can rest in the circle that we build. We can rest knowing that we hold the grief and gratitude in the same arms, that one cannot be fully without the other, and that through that, we find a power within ourselves and in our community. So may we use these challenging moments to connect more deeply with one another. May we send poems. May we sing songs. May we send each other love. And may we remember that that power that we have the opportunity to cultivate is always within our grasp when we build a circle that can contain it. May it be so, and amen.